There is a particular kind of silence that follows the realization that someone you trusted has used that trust as a tool. Not the silence of an argument, not the silence of grief, which has its own texture and weight. This silence is colder than both of those. It is the silence of understanding, arriving late, that the version of events you were given was constructed rather than true, and that the construction required effort, which means the deception was not impulsive. It was planned. I sat in that silence on a Tuesday morning in March, holding my phone, looking at the number of the bank calling me. A bank I had not chosen to have a relationship with. A bank whose number was in my phone only because my son had asked me to co-sign a loan 18 months ago, and the co-signing had required me to provide contact information. The bank was calling because my son had stopped making payments. My son, who had blocked my number 6 weeks after I signed. My name is Bernard Cole. I am 66 years old. I spent 32 years as a high school principal in Raleigh, North Carolina, which means I have spent my adult life in rooms where people told me what they needed me to believe while I tried to understand what was actually true. It is a skill that transfers, though I wish in this particular instance it had transferred faster. Welcome to Dad's True Emotions. Pull up a chair and stay with me tonight because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. You are exactly where you need to be. My son Terrence is 38 years old. He has his mother's charm and apparently a relationship with financial responsibility that I had not fully understood until the bank called me on a Tuesday in March to tell me that the loan I had co-signed was 4 months in arrears, and that as the co-signer I was now legally responsible for the outstanding balance. The outstanding balance was $41,000. Let me take you back to the beginning of this, because the beginning is important, and because understanding how I came to sign that document requires understanding who I believed Terrence to be at the moment I signed it. Terrence had moved to Charlotte 4 years ago for a job in commercial lending, which I had thought was a good fit for him because he was quick with numbers and good with people, and the combination, in that industry, tends to produce success. He had done reasonably well in the first 2 years. He called me monthly. He came home for the holidays. He was, by every available measure, a son whose adult life was developing in a satisfying direction. Then the calls became less frequent. The holiday visits became shorter. When I asked about work, he gave me answers that were complete enough to satisfy a casual question and thin enough to evade a thorough one. I noticed the thinness, but I did not press, because Terrence had always been someone who needed to process things privately before he shared them, and I had always respected that quality in him. What I did not know was that the commercial lending job had ended 14 months before the loan request. Terrence had been terminated for reasons that I would not learn until the bank called, reasons that involved a compliance issue that the institution had handled internally and quietly, which meant it would not show up in a standard background check, and which meant Terrence had been able to present himself to me as a man with ongoing employment rather than a man who had been out of work for over a year. He had been living on savings, then credit cards, then the specific geography of borrowed time that people occupy when they are managing the appearance of stability rather than its reality. He came to me in September of the previous year. He drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday, which was unusual because our visits had a rhythm, and this was outside it. He brought lunch from a place I liked, which told me he had thought about the visit in advance and wanted it to feel relaxed rather than purposeful. He was good at construction. I had always known he was good at construction. I had not understood how extensively he applied that quality to conversations with his father. We ate on the porch. He asked about my retirement, which I had begun 6 months earlier. He asked about the garden. He asked about the Raleigh neighbors I had known for 20 years. He was attentive in the way of someone who is building towards something and needs the foundation to be warm before they place the structure on it. Then he said, "Dad, I have an opportunity." I said, "Tell me about it." He told me about a business he wanted to start, a small commercial cleaning firm targeting the medical and professional office sector, which he said was underserved in the Charlotte area by reliable operators. He had done the research, he said. He had projections. He had a potential first client who had expressed interest pending the company's formation. The business plan he showed me on his laptop was detailed and well presented. The numbers were organized in a way that suggested professional preparation rather than hasty construction. The projected revenue was conservative. The startup costs were clearly itemized. He needed $41,000 for equipment, insurance, vehicle lease, and initial operating capital. He had applied for a small business loan. The loan had been conditionally approved, he said, pending a cosigner with demonstrated creditworthiness. He said, "Dad, you are the only person I trust with this." There is a sentence designed to close a conversation, not because it is threatening, because it is true. A father wants to be the person his son trusts with the things that matter. A father who has built his life around showing up for his children wants to believe that his son is coming to him because the relationship is sound and the trust is earned. I said, "Let me see the full application." He showed me what he had. I looked at it with the professional eye of a man who had spent 32 years reviewing documents and assessing presentations for accuracy and intent. It was good. Not perfect, but good. I said, "I will need a few days to think." He said, "Of course, take whatever time you need." I took 4 days. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Horn who had handled my affairs for 12 years, and I asked her to look at the co-signing terms. She reviewed what Terrence had sent and told me the standard cautions. Co-signing makes you equally liable. Default affects your credit. Know the person you are signing for. I thought I knew the person I was signing for. I co-signed the loan on a Wednesday afternoon in October. The first indication that something was wrong came 4 weeks after the signing. Terrence had been texting every few days with updates. The company was registered. Equipment was ordered. The first client meeting was scheduled. Each update was brief and positive and arrived with the specific regularity of someone who understands that regular updates reassure a cosigner. Then the update stopped. I sent a text asking how the first client meeting had gone. No response. I called. The call went to voicemail. I left a message. No return call. I tried again the following week. Voicemail again. I sent another text. This one did not deliver. The small icon that indicates delivery, the one I had been unconsciously nodding for years without knowing it, did not appear. I called from a different number. It rang. He did not answer. I sat with the not delivering text and the answered ring on an unknown number, and I understood what they meant together. Not individually, together. He had blocked my number. My son had co-signed a loan with his father, and then blocked his father's number. I called Patricia. I told her what had happened. She said, "Bernard, I need you to contact the loan servicer directly and put them on notice that you are the co-signer and that you have lost contact with the primary borrower." I said, "Should I be worried about the loan?" She said, "I think you should be prepared." I called the loan servicer. I explained my situation. The representative confirmed my cosigner status and noted my concern. She said she would flag the account. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday in March, the bank called. The representative who called me was a woman named Ellen. She was professional and straightforward in the way of someone who has made this kind of call many times and has developed the specific language for delivering unwelcome information clearly without unnecessary weight. She told me the loan was 4 months in arrears. She told me the primary borrower had not responded to repeated contact attempts. She told me that as cosigner I was jointly and severally liable for the outstanding balance, which at that point, with late fees and default penalties, had grown to $43,200. I said, "Ellen, "Can you tell me when the last payment was made?" She said one payment was made, the initial payment due 30 days after disbursement. One payment in 18 months, $43,000. I said, "Can you tell me anything about the stated business activity on the account?" She said she could tell me that the business had not filed any documentation with the bank as required by the loan terms after the first month. I said the loan was supposed to fund a commercial cleaning business. She said the equipment purchases documented at disbursement included some commercial cleaning equipment. She paused in the careful way of someone deciding how much to share. Some of the disbursed funds went to purchases that the underwriting team found inconsistent with the stated business purpose when we began our review. I said, "What kind of purchases?" She said personal travel, electronics, a vehicle purchase that was personal registration, not commercial. I sat with that for a moment, the Tuesday morning silence, the cold kind, the constructed kind. I said, "Ellen, I need to know what my options are." She told me I could bring the loan current by paying the arrears, which would stop the default proceedings but would leave me on the hook for the remaining principal and Terrence's ongoing failure to pay. I could allow the default to proceed, in which case both our credit histories would be significantly damaged and the bank would pursue collection. Or I could work with a financial attorney to explore whether the fraudulent use of loan proceeds created a separate legal avenue. She said that last option without emphasis professionally, but I heard the word fraudulent and I held it. I called Patricia before Ellen had finished the call. Patricia Horn had been practicing law for 26 years, and she had, in those years, seen most of what people are capable of doing to each other in the name of family and money. She received the information I gave her without surprise and with the focused efficiency of a woman who is already thinking 2 steps ahead. She said, "Bernard, the fraudulent use of loan proceeds is significant. If he represented the business as active when it was not, if he used the funds for personal purposes contrary to the stated loan purpose, and if he did so knowingly at the time of application, that is not a civil dispute. That is fraud." I said he was terminated from his lending job 14 months before he came to me. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you know that?" I said the bank's representative mentioned inconsistencies in the application when she was describing the account review. I called a former colleague of mine who knew someone at the institution where Terrence worked. The termination is documented. Patricia said, "Bernard, if he knew he had no income and represented himself as employed at the time of loan application, and if he used a business loan for personal expenses, the legal exposure is significant. Not to you, to him." I said, "What do I need to do?" She said 3 things. File a police report documenting the fraud. Cooperate with the bank's investigation, which will find the same things you have found. And prepare to have a very difficult conversation with your son. I said, "He has blocked my number." She said there are other ways to have that conversation. Some of them involve process servers. I did not use a process server first. I want to be honest about that, because the decision to try one more direct approach before engaging legal process was not weakness. It was the decision of a father who wanted to give his son the opportunity to choose honesty before consequences made the choice for him. I drove to Charlotte on a Thursday, not announced. I knew Terrence's address from the loan documents. I parked outside his apartment building at 7 in the morning and I sat in my car and I waited. He came out at 8:15. He was dressed for something, not the work clothes of a man running a commercial cleaning operation, but the casual ease of a man with an undemanding day ahead. He was taller than I remembered, which is what happens when you see your children infrequently enough that the image you carry is slightly out of date. He saw me before I was halfway across the parking lot. I watched the sequence of his recognition. First the familiarity, then the identification, then the specific expression of a man whose calculation has just failed. He stopped. I kept walking until I was close enough that the conversation did not require volume. I said, Terrence, I drove 4 hours. Please give me 20 minutes. He looked at the building. He looked at me. He said, Dad. I said, 20 minutes. That is all I am asking. He nodded. We sat in my car. I told him everything I knew, not as an accusation. Not with the raised voice of a man who is performing his anger for an audience, but with the level tone of a former principal, delivering a complete and accurate account of events to someone who already knows the events and is being given the opportunity to add their version. He did not try to deny much of it. He was smarter than that, and I think he was also, underneath the specific construction of the person who had blocked my number and spent $43,000 on things other than a cleaning business, still enough of the son I had raised to understand that this particular moment required something more honest than what he had been offering. He told me the job had ended. He told me the shame of it had been paralyzing, the specific paralysis of a person who has built their identity around professional competence and has lost the thing that competence was producing. He told me he had intended to start the business. He told me the first client had not materialized. He told me the money had been spent in the way money gets spent when a man is frightened and isolated and managing the appearance of function rather than the reality of it. He said, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I would fix it before it became what it became. I said, Terrence, you blocked my number. He looked at his hands. He said, I couldn't hear your voice asking how the business was going. I said, so you made it impossible for me to ask. He said, yes. I said, that is not a solution. That is a child's response to an adult problem, and you are 38 years old. He said nothing. I said, here is what is going to happen now. Patricia is going to contact you through her office. You are going to cooperate with the bank's investigation. You are going to provide a full and honest account of what the money was spent on and why. And then we are going to work with Patricia to figure out what legal exposure exists and how to address it in the way that causes the least permanent damage to your life while still being honest about what happened. He said, are you going to press charges? I said, the bank may press charges. I am going to cooperate with whatever investigation occurs, and I am going to tell the truth about what I knew and when I knew it. What happens after that is not entirely in my control. He said, Dad, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. Sorry is the beginning. It is not the resolution. He said, what do I do? I said, you call Patricia today. You answer when the bank calls. You stop managing the appearance of something you are not and start dealing with what you actually are, which is a person who made serious mistakes and who needs to address them directly. He said, okay. I said, and Terrence, unblock my number. Whatever happens next, you do not get to make yourself unreachable to your father while your father is legally liable for your choices. He took out his phone. I watched him do it. My name reappeared in his contacts with the specific small act of someone restoring something they should never have removed. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. I said, I know. I drove back to Raleigh. The 4 hours were different from the 4 hours down. Not easier exactly, but more settled. I had said what needed to be said. I had not said it with cruelty or with the performed righteousness of a man who is more interested in being right than in addressing reality. I had said it the way I had said difficult things for 32 years in rooms where young people needed to understand that consequences are not optional, but that the future is still available. Patricia worked with Terrence's cooperation to reach an arrangement with the bank. The fraud investigation produced findings that were serious, but not at the level that resulted in criminal charges, partly because Terrence cooperated fully and partly because the bank determined that a negotiated resolution was more productive than a protracted legal proceeding. The resolution required Terrence to repay the loan on a structured schedule, with a portion of my credit exposure reduced in exchange for my cooperation with the investigation. The damage to my credit was real and required time to address, which I am still in the process of addressing. Terrence found a job, not in lending, where his termination would follow him, but in operations management at a logistics company, which turned out to suit him in a way that lending never quite had. He called me on the first Sunday of every month. He answered when I called on the other Sundays. The calls were not always easy. We were rebuilding something on an honest foundation for the first time, which meant the foundation had to be cleared of what had been built on false ground, and that clearing was sometimes uncomfortable. He came to Raleigh at Christmas. He sat in my kitchen and he helped me make the meal that his mother used to make, the one that required 2 pots and specific timing, and a particular judgment call about the seasoning that both of us got slightly wrong in different ways, and we laughed about it, and we ate it anyway. He said, "Dad, I keep thinking about what you said, about the child's response to an adult problem." I said, "Are you still thinking about it, or have you moved past it?" He said, "I think about it when I am tempted to avoid something." I said, "That is the right use of it." He said, "Does it get easier, dealing with things directly?" I said, "It gets more habitual. Whether it gets easier depends on the thing." He said, "I'm going to pay you back, everything the bank didn't recover." I said, "Terrence, I did not co-sign that loan to be paid back. I co-signed it because you asked me to, and because I trusted you, and because that is what fathers do when their sons ask. The money is not what I want back." He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want the person who drove up here on a Saturday with lunch from the place I liked. I want the person who asked how the retirement was going and actually wanted to know the answer, not the construction of that person, the actual one." He looked at the kitchen table for a moment, then he looked at me. He said, "I think that person got lost for a while." I said, "I know, people do. The question is whether they find their way back." He said, "I'm trying to find my way back." I said, "I can see that, keep going." We finished the meal. We washed the dishes. He stayed through New Year's Day and drove back to Charlotte on the 2nd of January with the roads clear and a container of leftovers he did not need to take but wanted to. I stood at the door of my house in Raleigh and watched his car turn the corner. Then I went inside and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table in the January morning and thought about trust and what it costs when it is misused and what it requires to rebuild. It requires honesty. It requires time. It requires the specific patience of a man who has spent his career believing that people are capable of more than their worst moments. I still believe that, even on Tuesday mornings when the bank calls and the silence is the cold kind. Especially then. If this story reached you tonight, hit that like button and subscribe to Dad's True Emotions. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I will see you on the next one.